Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. I'm here today with Nick.
Hello.
And sadly, we're missing Warren today. But Warren, we hope to have you next time around. And,
we sad that we missed the Warren.
Yes, everything's better with the Warren.
That's right.
We're excited about our guest today, and we're excited about the show. And I'll be honest, I'm really interested about this topic because I feel like this is a topic that I don't know all that much about, and so I'm really excited because I'm hopeful that I'm going to be able to come away from this with incredible knowledge here. So Nick, how about you introduce our guest for us today?
Well, thank you, Chris. And you're quite right that this is a topic that most of us in IT, even in information security, know perilously little about. And I say perilously because there are things that we should actually know about that pass us by and that affect us and we don't know about it. And with that, there's a very mysterious introduction that I'm doing to Rufaro Warinda. Hello, Rufaro, and welcome to the Cloud Architects podcast.
Hi guys, how's it going? Hope everyone's doing well. Excited to be here as always.
Yeah, doing well. It's a cool episode for me because it's just after 5 p.m. Here in Sydney, so I'm not up at 4 a.m. or some other weird hour to record this like I typically am, right? So I like it when we have guests that are sort of in the EMEA time zone because it's a little bit easier for me. So, but yeah, doing pretty good. Absolutely. What's been going on, Nick and Rufaro? What have you guys been up to over the last little bit? I think it's definitely been a little while since we've kind of connected.
Oh, absolutely. And I think so many things have happened that you think what's happening in COVID land. And, Chris, you think you might have COVID at the moment, but you seem to be doing all right. And we generally getting on with the world. There's a lot of with a rebranding that's just happened with Microsoft and Purview. It's like, really? Did we have to rebrand? All this frustration around what is this product called now? And we got used to Defender, and now it's the Purview stuff. And Rufaro's world. Sorry, Chris.
I was saying I was just having a conversation with the customer about all of that stuff, and then the very next day there was a rebranding that made 75% of my prior conversation completely obsolete, and I had to go back to them and go about that thing we said yesterday. Let's revisit that conversation.
And Tony wrote a grumpy article about it, or it appears to be grumpy in the title. But so Tony, I'm referencing Tony Redmond, and he actually wrote a relatively well-written why does this happen and where does it make sense article. So I'm more than happy to refer folks to that one on Practical 365 to check that out. And what I like about Tony's writing is that he does reflect the real world view of, but why did we need to do this? But where's the silver lining and the possible benefit? So I think that does come with the benefit of the maturity that he's had in the industry for a while. And to be fair, he can be grumpy about whatever he wants to be grumpy about because he can be.
Yeah, and I think Mary Jo and Paul Thoreau, they also had some commentary on that on the Windows Weekly last week too. So everyone's kind of scratching their heads just a little bit, but hey, we're trying to get back to life as it as it was, and I think what's exciting about that is like conferences are coming back. Like we've been talking about how much we want to have in-person get-togethers again, and conferences are coming back, and I wanted to I don't think the guys at CommsV Next will mind me talking about their conference, but it came across my Twitter feed yesterday. And I kind of saw it and I thought, wow, this is cool. They're doing it an in-person conference, and it's CommsV Next, and it's a Microsoft UC conference. There've been a few of them, and I've never personally attended one. It's in Colorado. It's in Denver, and they're doing it in August. So it's the 16th and 17th of August. And it's a community conference, so obviously there are going to be a lot of MVP speakers there, and a lot of folks from the community. And I think it's something like to register If you do the early registration, I think it's like $99 or something, $99 for a ticket, which is, as far as these conferences goes, is pretty good value. So I figured I'd give a shout out to these guys. And if you're kind of interested, I'll put a link in the show notes, commsvnext.com. I'm hoping to be able to make this. Actually, I'm thinking that I might make the trip over. I was already planning to attend DEF CON 30, which is like the weekend before that, and so now it'll be a much nicer trip. I can do DEF CON and then I can go to commsvnext. So really excited about in-person conferences, in case you can't tell.
Don't blame me. So speaking of being excited, Rufaro is an extraordinary person, and I had the pleasure of meeting Rufaro a couple of months ago, and he is excited about the things that actually leave a lot of us in a cold sweat, if I can just be quite blunt about that, because he does something really well that most of us are quite frightened about, and that is compliance. When you ask, well, what kind of compliance, I think his answer would be very close to the rebel without a cause James Dean quote. Is like, well, what have you got to rebel against? And he is like, what do you need to be compliant to? And I've had the pleasure with working with Rufaro, and the auditor mindset that he brings to projects is just astounding. So by way of introduction, Rufaro, why don't we allow you to introduce yourself, and you can tell us unashamedly what you are excited about and how a spreadsheet that you spent years creating was ruined by a portal that got released by surprise.
Yeah, wow. Firstly, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction, Nick. It's great to meet you, Chris. And yeah, I guess I'm all things compliance, I guess. To allude to what Nick is speaking about with the whole spreadsheet that was deemed obsolete, essentially what I take an interest to is essentially mapping different compliance regulations across the board, specifically talking to tech and IT, and mapping them against each other and seeing where their similarities lie, and seeing what the optimum control, the optimum implementation is for any one compliance regulation or framework. So for example, you have CIS and you have ISO 27001. So it would be a matter of knowing that CIS is a better regulation or a better framework to follow if you're more into device management, endpoint management, and ISO 27001 is better to follow if you're more into risk, business continuity, asset management as well, access control. So it's a matter of figuring out what is the most optimum regulatory framework. But today, specifically, we're going to zero in on ISO 27001. And I will tell you why it is so important that we zero in on this today. The portal that Nick is speaking to or alluding to, again, is Compliance Manager, which now sits within Microsoft Purview. So world's turned upside down. Thanks, Microsoft, again. And essentially the regulatory framework, so I'll just give a bit of background about the framework itself. So ISO actually stands for in the International Organization for Standardization, and it's not an acronym. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the difference between legislative requirements and sort of regulatory is that legislative, you don't have a choice. The law is saying you've got to do this, right? Like we have POPI in South Africa, personal information, it aligns to GDPR, you can't get away from it, right? ISO 27001 mostly speaks to sort of the quality of the implementation that you're giving, and why it's so important for us is it talks about information security. And in IT, obviously, that is such a big thing. So we can talk to a whole bunch of different controls, a whole bunch of different requirements, but the end goal is information security. So the regulation, or the standard rather, the last update or prior to 2022 was 2013. And all these years, we've essentially been working off the same requirement standard. Now, from 2013 to 2022, tech and IT has changed quite a lot, right? And Microsoft's done an amazing job in creating this portal that essentially helps implementers or regulators rather within organizations. So essentially what they do is you've got improvement actions, and actual implementations for each of the various controls. And you can actually align that to specific Microsoft products or Microsoft implementations. For example, secure access is one. We know Microsoft is big on zero trust, and MFA can be directly linked to Annex 9.1.1.2, I think, within ISO 27001, and that speaks on access control. So if you bang in your MFA, you essentially meet the requirement, and that's how it goes essentially for endpoint management, talking to Intune, etc., etc. Now, the big thing is that Microsoft has assessment templates which talk to these improvement controls, but what they currently have is still aligned to 27001, 2013. And this year, the standard was updated to obviously accommodate cloud computing, and it's now on 2022. So what I thought would be fun was to sort of beat Microsoft at their own game and get to the point where we're mapping the various controls against the tech before they do. And eventually when they release the updates, we can compare ourselves. And if we feel as though they've lacked somewhere, we can, speak to them and ask them, hey guys, what do you think about this? And that's essentially what I've been working on for the better part of a month or so. And yeah, just to give some context, there are 11 new controls. And these controls are massive, and they specifically talk to cloud computing. So what I'll do is I'll go through each control, and we'll make this a little bit of a challenge, right? And I'll put to you guys what you think, what you would use within the full Microsoft suite to actually fulfill or satisfy that requirement. So if I was an auditor, for example, and I'm coming in and I'm asking you the question, right? And we'll start off with the first control, and that is threat intelligence. So I'll give a description, and then I'll open the floor, and then we'll move on from there and see how far we can get. All right, fair enough? You guys didn't think
Chris,
this is
I bet you didn't expect this at the show, right?
No, I didn't, but I have an advantage because I'm pretty sure that the answer is going to start with Defender or Purview.
All right, so let's get straight into it. So the first one is Annex 5.7. Don't worry about the actual referencing, just worry about the wording, and that's threat intelligence. So the description goes, this control requires you to gather information about threats and analyze them in order to take appropriate mitigation actions. This information could be about particular attacks, about methods and technologies the attackers are using, and or about attack trends. You should gather this information internally as well as from external sources like vendor reports, government agency announcements, etc. So what Microsoft solutions are we proposing off the top of your head?
That what would you, because it's not one thing though. I mean, you wouldn't
exactly,
you wouldn't say that it's Sentinel,
it's a mix,
or it's, you know what I mean? It's not going to be one thing. It's going to be multiple things that work together to kind of achieve that result.
Including EDR and XDR. So there's that. You've got Defender for Office 365, which gives you signaling from a mail point of view. So you understand what's potentially happening there. Then, of course, if we're talking about threat intelligence, you want to look at what we used to call CASB, which is Defender for Cloud, so that you can instrument what your users are doing. So talking to insider threats as well as external threats, because Defender for Cloud implicitly includes controls for things like malware and malware execution. So if files get renamed to .encrypt and you've got whatever threshold there are within a certain time frame. So this is, and what's nice about this control is that depending on the amount of money that you've spent in the Microsoft stack, tells you what you could potentially switch on or off, but you can meet this control without being licensed up to the hilt. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of the work that Rufaro has done, is that he's able to tell us, well, depending on how much money you've spent and what license you've got, you can still be compliant without having to spend absolutely everything on your entire budget on an M365 E5 with E5 or EMS, what used to be called EMS E5 uplift, right?
Yeah. Yeah, man. And
So
that's
how do we do, Rufaro?
it did really well. I was actually wondering. I mean, I've got a document here, and it's actually got a great illustration of what you guys were talking about. It's got the triage tier from tier 1 to tier 3. It does go through a defender for endpoints, a defender for Office 365, for identity, and it does mention XDR in there. So really, really well done. Like that's. I mean, but what else are we expecting? Yeah, what else are we expecting from the panel that we have here? So
Goose gets a fail.
and just to sort of gauge the context of what just happened right now is that we have the responsibility to bridge two worlds, right? And you have regulators on one side who would have had absolutely no idea about what you guys were just talking about and the relevance of it and how it's auditable and how it actually meets the requirement of the control based off of information security. Because at the end of the day, threat intelligence is there to prevent external breaches and as well as internal leakages. So to bridge that gap to someone who comes in and someone who works in legal or in compliance or in internal auditing or in risk is essentially why I'm here and why I exist and why I have to play on both sides of the fence and in understanding their world so much as understanding our world and bringing the two together and actually being able to implement the relevant controls and see also where they're lacking, because that also gives great indication and great direction for the people that develop these solutions to understand that it's not really just about getting to the point of compliance. It's about actually achieving the point of information security, which is what we're all here to do. So while we attempt to get Nick back, we can
yes,
about,
this happens, right? That load shedding probably or something.
Yeah, I was about to say it's probably it's load shedding in SA.
So I mean, obviously this is a super interesting topic, and I can definitely see why having someone who can kind of bridge the gap or speak to both sides of the business makes a lot of sense, right? But I feel like a lot of the challenge that organizations face with ticking these control boxes is that oftentimes they have a policy, like if they have a policy, because a lot of them don't, or they say they do, but they really don't have anything formalized. That policy has been sitting in a drawer somewhere or on a file share somewhere for years and hasn't been updated at all, right? Because it's amazing how many folks don't keep up with the changes in these. Now, obviously, from 2013 to 2022 is a fairly long, like it's a long time that it hasn't changed. But other frameworks, for example, like NIST changes regularly, right? And it's amazing how often you speak to a customer about, password compliance, for example, right? And then we're following all the NIST guidelines as far as password compliance goes, and then they're following like 3 versions back, right? And it hasn't occurred to them that
there is an update.
There's an update, and that this is not a set and forget situation. Like to stay compliant, it has to be almost like follow a DevOps cycle where you're constantly improving. So I bet that keeps you very busy.
Yeah, I know it definitely does. It always keeps you on your toes as well. I mean, in the world that we work, every time Microsoft releases an update, we sort of have to just conform. So I'm used to that cycle of continuous improvement, but it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's actually a requirement within the standard itself. I mean, Clause 10 purely talks about continuous improvement and how compliance is never a destination. It's always a process that you constantly go over and constantly go through. And we do get caught up in, I follow the regulation and this is what it says and this is how I get to that. And people just sort of, that's where people get stuck when you're doing it for the sake of being audit ready. I call it audit compliance, because all you're doing is not to improve the business, but just to be audit compliance. And the big control, actually, I think I'm going to move it along. And there are 2 of them, because these, like Chris just mentioned, where there's a policy that it's probably been sitting in a drawer for ages and ages and ages, and no one actually thinks about it. And the implementation for that, excuse me, is then lost and then dumbfounded. So in this case, excuse me, in this case, you have what's called an information management policy. Now, in the olden days, what we used to do is you'd have an information tag, or you'd have an information label that says that this information is confidential. Only top management is allowed to see this document. We put a big stamp on it. It says confidential in big red, and everyone knows, okay, I'm not authorized to touch that. It gets locked up in a cabinet somewhere. It gathers dust, or it's used frequently, and the people who are supposed to refer to it, right? Company financials used to be done on hardcover books. I don't know if you guys remember those 400-page hardcover books with all the blocks in them, and that's how accountants used to work. But the world's changed now, right? We've got the full Office 365 suite, and people are now utilizing document management. We go as far as SharePoint. We've got intranets, we've got workflows, we've got Teams linking in the back to SharePoint, and we've got a much more collaborative space. And by virtue of that, people have a lot more access to information by default, right? And the challenge was, how do we regulate this, and how do we make sure we preserve what the information management policy says, where this policy, or this set of documentation is internal use only, or it's confidential, or it's completely restricted, and only a number of subset of people can actually use it. So ISO 27001 was lacking in this regard, in trying to give the direction for people on how to implement this specific requirement or this specific control with the 2013 version, because it was just a requirement for an information management policy. And that was a mandatory requirement, and the policy is there, but the management and the implementation was sort of where it was hitchy and where it was sticky. So we have two new controls that have come up. First one, information deletion, and the second one is data masking, right? So I'll start with information deletion, and the description goes as follows. This control requires you to delete data when no longer required, in order to avoid leakage of sensitive information and to enable compliance with privacy and other requirements. This could include deletion in your IT systems, removable media, or cloud services.
Wow.
So,
that's non-trivial.
So hey, Chris, all those buckets, man, all those AWS buckets that are just sitting out there, someone's going to have to delete some of them sometime.
But did you hear removable media, Chris? And what is your strategy to deal with the risk of information that's out there that you don't even have a catalog of? You know, we think, okay, probably I've got an encrypted file on a USB stick, so I don't care. But how much stuff have you got that you just share with someone really quickly, be it via an anonymous URL, or you've copied it on a drawer full of USB sticks? I think like we all have those, right? Or in bags, or we lose them in the parking lot. So these are real challenges. And what I want to come back to is, sometimes we are in the position where compliance is a grudge thing, right? Because as Rufaro says, I'm doing compliance to pass audit. However, I have spoken to CISOs that do security for mines, as an example. And one of the comments came back to me was that if we are out of compliance, people die.
Yes.
And that's pretty sobering. We have customers who own nuclear reactors. Think about them being out of compliance, and the engineering drawings to a nuclear reactor appearing on OneDrive shared anonymously because there's no control around that information. And that while that may seem dramatic, a few months ago now, I'm trying to remember where we are in the year, there was an accident in Russia where miners died. And it turns out that the compliance certificate was falsified because they actually didn't want to do the inspection. So they just blanket passed it and said, yes, we're compliant, right? And then a couple of weeks later, people were being pulled out of mine shafts, having asphyxiated, that's a difficult word, and they died because someone didn't care to actually follow the letter of compliance. And where we are in the world today, and I think Rufaro has moved out of audit land into IT land, and been here long enough, because he used to be an auditor, but now he talks to customers about, well, what do I actually need to do? Tell me, what do I actually need to do? And he's been there long enough to be able to give the kind of real world advice, which is why I wanted to bring him on this show, to make the point that compliance isn't just there as a luxury. Compliance is the kind of thing that if you take your information security seriously in any regard, you need to know where to start. And a compliance framework will give you that, where do I start adulting? You know, what are my framework, my rules, where do I begin? It gives you that place to start where you have something that you can reference, that you can measure, and you know how well or how badly you're doing. It doesn't give you guarantees. It doesn't say that you're never going to be hacked or leaked or whatever, but it does give you that guideline of, how do I begin to be a responsible adult with the stuff that's been entrusted to me? Rufaro, is that fair?
Yeah, 100%. Okay, Chris, do you have a?
I like how you break that down. But but let's just say that you're like, what happens before that, right? Before you start adulting, like, you got to be a teenager, right? How do you decide even on a framework to follow? Because I feel like that in itself, because there are so many frameworks, right? I think here in Australia we have something called Essential 8, which I'm just learning about now, having spent a lot of time in the US dealing with NIST and CIS, right? And so now being back here, folks are talking a slightly different language because there's other frameworks here. Now, obviously, they've all got certain commonalities in them, right? And some of the controls are the same or similar. Whenever I've always been asked this question in the past by customers, like, hey, I have nothing right now, where do I start? My answer to them has always been, look, I think CIS is a really good way to get into the mindset of what you need to do, unless you have a reason to, if you're doing business with another company and they require you to be ISO certified or compliant, then obviously that's an easy answer, right? But what happens if you don't have that? Like, is there a better answer to the one I've just given? What do you think?
Yeah, and what I think is, when people talk about compliance and sort of aligning to a framework, we look too far out when the answer really is sitting right in your organization most of the time. So my number one rule is have a risk-based approach. Now, what that means is see where your bread is buttered, right? How do you make your money? How does your business run? What is your, when you talk, and you have to align to, and you have to talk to business continuity a little bit. So if you're a mine, right? What is our purpose, right? To mine minerals, and how do we do that? And when you get to the how do we do that part, it starts talking to your processes, your policies, your procedures, what processes you guys actually follow to achieve that goal, right? And you start, and when you look and you dumb down and look at those specific policies or processes, you start seeing that, hey, this one is quite important. This is something like, if we don't do this, we don't mine gold, and that's the end of it. The business closes and the business shuts its doors. So what I always encourage organizations to do is look at where your bread is buttered. Find where, what the goal of your business is and what your business actually does. So for example, a data center will be more inclined to be aligned to CIS because of purely how it's more device management, endpoint management, and how it's more in tune and in depth in that, where a consulting firm that works mostly in the cloud would look mostly towards something like ISO 27001, ITIL, Corbett, etc. So it's about starting internally and building up from that, right? And when you're looking at the top-down effect of what's required of me, so the question is, how do we become compliant within our organization? But if you want to look at it, you can also look at it from a top-down approach and see what's required of me to actually function to the best of my ability within this industry, right? And that starts up top with the law, because no one has a choice to follow the law. And once you've looked at the legislative requirements, you come down a level below and see what regulatory frameworks there are out there. And then below that, you would look at your policies and your procedures. So there's essentially a breadcrumb trail to follow, and it becomes quite self-explanatory. You'll find in a lot of industries where, if you have that mindset, and it also relates across if you're with Microsoft as well, if you're working within Compliance Manager, because the data protection baseline assessment that they give you has 3,084 controls. If I'm not mistaken, there might be more, there might be less now. But I mean, if you're a mid to small size organization, you're not necessarily going to be required or need to implement all 3,000 of those controls. And Microsoft gives you this big compliance score at the end of it, and it says, okay, cool, you're compliant, but it's a process of continuous improvement, like we'd mentioned. So it's really important to see what's most important to you as an organization, because when you are now tasked with implementing a framework aligned to your ISO 27001s, your Corbett, your ITILs, your SOXs, it can be overwhelming because there's a lot to cover. But if you literally look at the risk factor, right, you quickly see that, okay, this is quite important. I'll make the example of the banking industry, right? They have PCI DSS, the card payment industry data standard that they have to comply to, right? So with that, you can already see that personal information and unique identifiers become quite important, because that's literally the bread and butter of that industry, right? A lot of security questions to authenticate users, to get into their accounts, bank numbers, ID numbers, they're all integrated in there, and that's literally the treasure chest, because if any of those things are breached or any of those things are leaked, that's essentially game over. So you will get to know, and it's good thing to do research as well, like how we operate in tech as well. Use cases, these are relevant in the compliance world as well. So if there's another data center, or there's another compliance or another just lost the word now, another consulting firm, excuse me, out there that's been walked this road before you, that's a use case example. You know, pull their information there. I know there are a bunch of articles that are put forward. Microsoft also has a bunch of number of articles from different auditing firms that have audited them externally, and you can use that essentially to get on your bike, I guess, and start riding down this path of compliance greatness. Now back to the two controls that I was talking about. And I think this will really show the level of importance of this, because the issue that I have is that the requirement to implement these controls isn't necessarily on IT's shoulders. And that's the thing. So the guys that work in IT mostly worry about your managed services tasks, the sort of onboarding, offboarding, I can't get into my computer, what do I do type of thing. And that's the typical thing within IT in an organization. And obviously I'm dumbing it down because we do a lot of important work. But the requirement for information management mostly falls on legal and internal audit, right? So enabling these users, because you actually have the ability to assign the responsibility for these controls within your tenant, compliance manager, to relevant administrators, and give them the relevant administrative access to be able to execute those duties that they need to follow, right? So we're talking about information deletion, and that requires you to delete data when it's no longer required, right? And lo and behold, Microsoft has information governance, which is this amazing thing that automatically fixes and sorts this problem out, because you can set retention policies on specific containers, locations, user mailboxes, what have you, teams, for example, as well. And that retention policy protects you from two things. The first thing is, like, for example, we're mentioning the building design drawings, where at some point we may need to refer to these drawings for maybe the next 15 years or for the next 30 years. And we have to have them preserved to make sure that no one deletes them, right? So you implement a retention policy, it holds it in there, and it archives it, holds it in a container, and you're able to then pull from that as and when and if needed, right? And we can go into the detail of that, but for the purpose of this conversation, we'll move right along. And the next one is, I'll make the example of Poppy. And now Poppy in South Africa is mostly aligned to GDPR, and talks mostly to personally identifiable information and personal information. And we have rights. I have rights. You have rights as to how long somebody is allowed to keep your personal information for, be it medical records, be it your identification, be it your account numbers, whatever it is, right? And the actual requirement out of the legislation states that you shall not keep personal records for longer than what is necessary, right? Now that's very broad, but at the same time, it also forces the organization to look into how long do we need to keep people's information for? right? And you run into this wall where there's a lot of waffle that's kept unnecessarily. And and like we mentioned with Microsoft, assume breach, and you have zero trust policies, that you could have, if you're a consulting firm, for example, this is very, very big because you have multiple clients that trust you with their information, be it access into their tenant, be it users, etc. You get to a point eventually once you've offboarded and you finished with the customer, maybe you've kept their folder structure in your SharePoint, and I mean, for archiving purposes as well, you've kept it in your SharePoint facility or in your intranet, and it's then forgotten for 8 to 10 years, and God forbid there's an information breach and someone gets into all of that. You can't even trace the breadcrumbs to say what's been stolen, what's been taken, how vulnerable were we when this happened, and all of a sudden you're caught in a situation where you've given this client an assurance that you would protect their information, but we're now 8-10 years down the line and say, hi, remember me? Just wanted to let you guys know that this has happened. And the question that they would ask is, why do you still have all of this information? And now you are now prosecutable by law. So information deletion is quite a handy thing as well. And also for the sake of migration purposes as well, since I also work in that space, get rid of the stuff that you don't need. And if you know it's something that you're going to forget or not refer to much, set a retention policy on there, and it can delete and it can retain and it can do what it needs to do at the end of that life cycle. It can be fixed and it can be fixed. So.
It's an interesting, the whole sort of deletion retention conversation is a really interesting one especially when you work or have worked in the email space like Nick and I have, right, for a long time, because we went from this sort of process where on-premises disk was expensive, so people were Nazis about quotas and getting rid of information or taking information out of the original storage location and putting it in a cheaper place. And then we went into the cloud where everyone now has like this massive mailbox that everyone sees as basically a target, right? Like, I'm going to fill this thing up. And a lot of companies don't bother to be stringent about, quotas and the governance of the data. I did some work with a customer a few years ago, and their stance was everything in the mailbox gets deleted after 3 months, unless and the argument was, because I said, like, I love it, except that's really, like, 3 months is not a lot of time, right? And there was the guy I was talking to said, well, look, there's a couple of things here. One, corporate data that is important that needs to be retained shouldn't be in email. It should be in an archive somewhere else, right? And two, we delete stuff because if we don't have it, then we can't provide it in any form of legal proceeding. And I thought it was a crazy answer, but that's their stance, right? Because, I mean, look, they're a massive multinational company, and they're just like, that's how we do it. It's like, if it's older than 3 months, we don't have it because it's been deleted.
For sure.
So very interesting conversation. I think it's definitely something that we need to get back to, having those conversations with our customers. Like, hey, what are you actually doing about data retention? Because data is everywhere now. It's not just the stuff in SharePoint or the stuff on, if you still have file servers and file shares or email boxes. It's everywhere. Data. We've got data in Teams now. We've got data.
Exactly.
And we have metadata, right? So we had this on a previous show where we discussed that our vendors have got metadata on us, which is gives them the ability to infer behavior. And of course, that's what we look at with Viva. The very premise of Viva is that Viva knows what we're doing and is therefore able to recommend health habits to our upstream managers based on our working behavior, or the fact that we click on an email after working hours. So question to you, Chris, is that, I purposely had you walk into this conversation cold and it was a little bit of a setup, because you are a respected and a certified information security professional. And I
don't know about respected, but we'll take it.
So, let's just go with certified then. So you're a certified professional, right? And a lot of the times you would drown in detail, but without necessarily being able to abstract up to what we used to look at as a grudge, which is compliance, right? Why do I care about compliance? So let me ask you, on the other side of this, where are you at in terms of how your perceptions towards compliance are potentially shifting?
Look, I definitely think there's been a shift in my mindset of compliance over the last few years, right? Certainly, the more work I've been doing in the security space has got me thinking differently about compliance. Because I think also when you come out of the IT pro space, and that's your vantage point, you're used to ticking the boxes, right? A lot of the times you're going through the motion just to tick a box, and you got to do that once a year or whatever the case is, and oftentimes you end up spending money to tick that box, right? You buy XYZ platform that advertises it can tick those boxes for you. But I think once you kind of move out of that and you start shifting your view a little bit and start looking a little bit more at how do you help the business manage risk and things like that, I think you start looking at these things a little bit differently. Oftentimes they're enablers, right? And I think if we go back to our data security conversation from a few months ago with Ernie Anderson, a lot of the times you have to take that approach, start from the top and look down and say, what are we trying to do here, right? And how does this fit in with what we as a business are looking to achieve? So, Rufaro, I loved how you kind of broke down or distilled where do you start, right? Because if I'm an IT consultancy business and my brother is an accountant, chances are we're not going to start at the same place, because you know what I mean? Like, we have different things that mean different things to different things are important to him and that are to me, but also we have different risks, right? And this conversation is so interesting just because of the time that it's kind of come up, right? I'm in the process at the moment of dealing with tons of just insurance stuff and business insurance stuff and business risk stuff associated to insurance, and insurance companies driving me crazy and reading all this legal jargon that it doesn't make any sense to me. So this is great because this kind of adds context to a lot of the reason these questions are being asked of me, right?
No, 100%, and I think it's quite important as well. It's nice that you mentioned on how it's a tick box. It's a tick box exercise for most of the people that work in our space, because you're trying to get it done, and you're willing to pay money just to tick those boxes. And one of the other things Nick mentioned was, and it's another one of my hobbies, I guess. Maybe Microsoft wouldn't be too happy about it, but nonetheless, we continue. And I look at I look at what an E5 license gives you and an E3 license gives you, right? And all the special, the added featuring, the nice shiny things that an E5 license gives you, and see how could you get to the same goal, even if it takes you longer and it's a bit more strenuous. How could you get to the same goal using an E3 license? And what that does is it infers the mentality of thinking about the problem first before running out to find a solution or tech implementation for it, right? And you get this quite a lot, where companies will have multiple applications to sort of complete this holistic security, trying to secure the organization holistically. But it increases your risk, because you've created so many more points of vulnerability where they're all not centralized, they're all not talking to each other, where something is bound to fall through the cracks. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't federate identities from somewhere else and use CyberArk and all these great technologies. What I'm saying is that you need to think about, when you're expanding on your security application suite, or the number of features that you go into, are you solving the problem, or are you just creating more vulnerabilities? And that's a conversation to have as well. But again, moving on to the second control.
But before you move on to that control, I just want to point out that one of the risks that I talk to customers about is having licenses for products that actually aren't configured. Because now you've got capability which is actually unmanaged, and unmanaged capability is actually risk.
That's a vulnerability, yeah, exactly.
Back to you, Rufaro.
It's as simple as that. Thanks, Nick. So the second control, and I think you guys would enjoy this one. You'd actually this is where the fun starts, right? So the description reads, this control requires you to use data masking together with access control in order to limit the exposure of sensitive information. This primarily means personal data because they are heavily regulated through privacy regulations, but it could also include other categories of sensitive data. Now, what we deem as sensitive information is that scope is huge, right? Because it's essentially, are we talking about the identity of a user, or is it a certain asset in the business? What are we actually alluding to here?
All of the above, right?
Exactly, right? And that's the thing. So when I looked at this control within the Microsoft suite and what it offers, there's actually a long list. And I'm going to go through all of it, and then we can have a conversation after that, obviously. So with information protection, this is protecting your data, to apply flexible protection actions that include encryption, access restrictions, and visual markings, and using the following capabilities. So here we go, right? We're ready. We've got sensitivity labels. We have Azure Information Protection, Unified Labeling Clients. We've got double encryption keys, Office 365 message encryption, service encryption with customer key, SharePoint Information Rights, IRM, Rights Management Connector, Azure Information Protection Unified Labeling Scanner, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, Azure Purview, and Microsoft Information Protection SDK. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? We can expand
Chris, you could spend a year switching that on.
Yeah.
I actually did spend a good amount of time switching a lot of those things on for a customer in Europe a few years ago. Yeah, it's I mean, and then there's if you're talking about the product too, like there's the changes that are being made to the client now, because there's a new AIP client coming out. So these things are kind of starting to merge and blend into one. So yeah. I was going to say, you could have also called this control "Don't end up on Troy Hunt's website." That could, that's enough of a deterrent, because most people now know if you wake up in the morning and you've got an email from "Have I been pwned?" there's been trouble somewhere.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, we've touched on a few of these controls, and I will share the document where it goes in depth with each one of them and the relevant Microsoft products that you can use, or the tooling that you can use to execute those. But I think it's also a good idea for organizations to don't just run straight to compliance manager, because that will be overwhelming. Even for someone like me who appreciates and who delves head first into this work, it was very overwhelming to look at exports of 3,000 controls, because these are implementations that do span across, right? And I think it's very important for organizations to look internally and see what our requirements are. So if we'd looked at the control, right, and I did it purposefully for us to look at the control first and have us think about, okay, what would I use to execute this, right? And the process of continuous improvement may be that you started with a particular implementation on maybe you applied mail flow rules on your exchange admin center or your exchange tenant. You realize that this actually applies to my greater stack, and I have to include other technologies in this, and it has to sit above that, and actually has to sit within Azure, the rules that I'm applying. And then you're improving, and then you're realizing that, okay, I'm looking at my full tech stack, I'm looking at what's important to me, I'm looking, and you develop that as you go along. So to make your life easier, first thing, risk-based approach, look at your policies and procedures, right? Then once you've done that, find which framework essentially, or which regulatory requirements you have. If you're a stringent if you're stringently regulated, like your insurance companies, your banking industries, you obviously know what you need to comply to, and your assessment templates will probably be on Microsoft Compliance Manager anyway. But then start looking for the regulatory framework afterwards. And once you've done that, you'll see pretty quickly that a lot of these controls are like for like across the board. So Microsoft will have a single control, right? And we'll take the easiest one is MFA. Now, MFA satisfies a number of different controls across a number of frameworks. And what you're actually seeing and what you're actually doing is you're ticking a lot of the boxes, or you're ticking a lot of the boxes by ticking one box. You're killing three birds with one stone, right? And what that does is if you go through multiple audits a year for specific requirements, you can show one control and one implementation that you're doing to satisfy that one control that applies across the board, right? And this means a lot to the guys in IT, because we are registered, guys that sit in internal audit that have to manage the greater compliance of the organization. And you start to flesh out and cut out a lot of the excess fat within the organization. And you actually figure out that you can manage this very slim, but you can also be very particular and very risk adverse about it. So it's an exchange, right? You will have to put in a bit of work to begin with, but once you get into the rhythm of things, it really is it's something that can be managed quite well, and it's something that also becomes everyone's responsibility. I think the perception is that information security and security is just the responsibility of the people, the cybersecurity specialists that are in the organization, but it's actually everyone's responsibility. And I mean, if we use sensitivity labels, for example, where you're empowering the user to understand the information management policy, to say, okay, this document, what level of sensitivity does it have? What level of privacy do I have to inflict on it? And while they're working on it within Word or wherever they're working on it, really, they can apply a sensitivity label to it that'll say, hey, this is personal document, this is a financial document, this is confidential, this is etc. All the permissions will be applied to that object, right? Or if it's sitting in a container where you have the sensitivity label applied to the container, it's already taken care of. And that doesn't become anyone else's issue down the line. And that actually takes away the requirement to have an information management policy on paper, because you've built it into the system that you work on every single day. So yeah, I think
what was really important there as well is that this isn't, when you have the process of continual improvement, right, that should tell people that this isn't it isn't like a binary thing. You don't just go from not complying to compliant overnight and then happy days. Like this is a process that if you're doing it right, you're kind of kicking the can on your maturity up, down the road continuously, and you're just getting better at every audit cycle, right? Instead of going from nothing. So very
but
useful.
as you know, with information security, it's the same thing. You don't just buy a product and implement it and now you are secure. Information security is all around continuous improvement, because the threats that you're guarding against moves, and they move with technology. And one of the biggest things that we see is the threats of automation and cloud scale against our customers, and how do they guard against that. But I think that's a rabbit trail for another show.
Squirrel.
Many squirrels. So what we're going to do is we're going to include this in our show notes so that our viewers and our listeners can see that and have a reference to it. Rufaro, what I liked about what you positioned was that it gives our folks a place to start, and it's a real world place to start, as just opposed to being massively overwhelmed and we actually don't know where to go. So we are coming up to the top of the hour, and we want to respect that we sadly have got time constraints, because honestly we could wallow in this topic at length and at breadth. It's wonderful. Is there anything before we land the show that you would like to plug, that you want? How do you want people to find you? Are you a LinkedIn person, or would you prefer something on Twitter? What is it that you'd like to plug, and how would you like to be found?
I think my LinkedIn is probably the best place to go, because that's always where I take sort of reference articles from different industries and then make it relevant to another industry. So if something big is released on the law side related to IT, write a bit about it, inform people that way, and vice versa. So I think LinkedIn is the best place for that. And my name and surname are in the box below, as you can see. And yeah, I have quite a unique name, so you will find me. Trust me.
That's wonderful. Chris, I don't know about you, but every time we have these kind of conversations, it is a horizon broadener for me, and it gives me so much to think about and to appreciate in customer conversations.
Yes, and it also just it's a sobering reminder of the fact that there's just so much stuff that I just don't know. right? Like no one person can know everything about everything. So it's always great to be able to talk to folks who are, very knowledgeable about certain areas of things that, I sometimes touch on, but don't ever really get very deep, right? So yeah, fantastic conversation, Rufaro. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. It's great.
It was great. We loved having you on the show, and I think this is definitely a topic that we'd like to have a repeat on at some stage, because compliance is something that moves, and our industry moves and flexes with that.
Yeah. CIS version 8 is now out. We've moved up from 7.1, so maybe that's an idea for the next time.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for making the time to come to the show, and we sincerely appreciate the depth that you bring to this topic and how you are able to articulate this into English for normal humans.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me, guys. Cheers.